I assume that you have been briefed on the events leading to the Cardassian withdrawal.
Yes, sir. I understand they spent the last half-century robbing the planet of every valuable resource before abandoning it.
They've left the Bajorans without a means of being self-sustaining. The relief efforts we've been coordinating are barely adequate.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Positively Trek Book Club with me, Dan Gunther. And with me is, back again, Bruce Gibson. Bruce, how's it going?
Hi-de-ho. How you doing?
Getting spoiled having you back on the show for a few episodes now, so this is exciting. I'm sensing a trend, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they've all had to do with books, so that shows you something too, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I love them books. I love them books. I love them Star Trek books. Bring them on. I want more. I want more. Have we had a new one lately? Because I would really like to read a new one.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because we actually have, and I know I say this every time, but it's a little bit of a rarity these days to get a Star Trek novel, but I feel like we're picking up momentum. We're getting a few more. You know, it's not quite the desert of Star Trek books it's been for a little while. We're getting a few more. And recently was released Star Trek The Next Generation, Pliable Truths by the amazing Dayton Ward. And I have to talk him up and praise him because, of course, he is here, as he always is, in our green room, as you know. But we've actually invited him into the studio today to talk about the book. So, Dayton, welcome back to Positively Trek.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. It's been, about a year since we did this?
It's been a while, yeah. Too long, for sure.
Well, I'm sure opinions vary. But yeah, we'll go with that. We'll go with that for now.
Well, in this host's humble opinion, definitely been too long.
Yeah, same. Although I read your social posts like every day. So I feel like
yes.
I'm always connected to you.
A little bit of me goes a long way.
I do appreciate your take on various events, and it's always a pleasure to read for sure. So,
you know, I go with what the news feeds me, and of course, it's been a target-rich environment for the last couple of days. So,
yeah, I can always tell your mood. You know, on a daily basis, I can tell if you're in a good mood or bad mood.
I'm usually always in a good mood. That doesn't mean I won't pop off about something here and there, but I tend to go through most days in a good mood.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm in a really good mood because I read an awesome Star Trek novel recently, Star Trek The Next Generation, Pliable Truths. Let's jump right in and talk about this. I'll give a warning ahead of time. I think the first part of this conversation will be spoiler free, but I think it's going to be a very short part of the conversation because I really want to get into this book quickly. So this book, immediately, as soon as the premise was released and we got that back cover blurb, I was so excited for this because I'm such a huge Deep Space Nine fan. I love the idea of where you've placed this book in the timeline and exactly what's going on in it. So let's start with that. Where did the idea come from to do the kind of transition period of, you know, TNG to DS9, kind of the pre-Emissary, post-chain of command thing going on here?
Oh, well, all right. First of all, before we go any further, I'm going to apologize in advance in case I do drop an accidental spoiler. I just did one of these the other night, and it took me 90 seconds to drop a spoiler. And I hadn't even planned on it. So I apologize to the listeners in advance, just in case. I will try to do better this time. Anyway, as far as the book and how it came to be, it's been about a year ago, I guess, more. I had just finished, or I just dropped the Discovery novel had just come out, or was about to come out. My editor at Simon & Schuster, she asked me specifically for a Next Generation book for this year. And further, the other, not mandate, but strong request, whatever you want to call it, was that it be set during the series, the TV series. They wanted to kind of rewind a little bit after all the post-movie stuff that we'd been doing all those years. So then the other request was that it also be a crossover with Deep Space Nine. That was my request from the editor. That's all the information I got. So I was intrigued by the idea of doing a next-gen story set during the series because, as I had pointed out elsewhere, this would be the first time I've done a TNG novel set during the series. Everything I've done or done with Kevin has been either in between movies or after the last Next Gen movie. So this is different for me. Kind of like writing a classic 5-year mission novel with Kirk and the gang, right?
That's kind of amazing to me too, just because you've written so many novels as well. Like
Right.
it kind of blew my mind when I realized that.
It didn't dawn on me at first until I started doing the research. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I've never done this. Holy Moses. How does that happen? So Kevin and I did one short story way back when, for the 20th anniversary anthology that was set during, I think, the first season. And otherwise, it's always been in between the movies or after the last one. So after I came to grips with that, I started looking around. And I started, looking at the list of episodes, and I'm like, okay, it's a pretty narrow window of when Next Generation and DS9 overlap. There's only about a season and a half, right? Up a little bit longer if you count up to Generations, but DS9 premieres not quite, but very close to the halfway mark of Next Gen's sixth season. So already we have a narrow trail to walk. It's like, okay, the stakes are pretty close. So what within what kind of story can I tell within that gap that's interesting? And then there are logistical hurdles that come into play. Like, for example, Worf having never met any of the DS9 characters for sure, or most of them, until he is assigned to DS9 in that show's fourth season. So I'm like, well, that's great. What am I going to do now? Now I got to find something else for Worf to do that has nothing to do with what's going on the station, and probably not let him interact with any of the DS9 characters. So that was one check mark in the complications box if we're going to role play this, right? This is a complication. So then I started dialing in on what was interesting about Next Gen, and it didn't take very long for me to narrow in on the aftermath of Chain of Command. When Picard is recovering from his torture at the hands of Gulman Dread. Very raw, very visceral. He's obviously affected by this at the end of that episode. And then we get to the next Generation episode, and it's like, never happened. That's episodic TV for you. So that happens. We were still dealing with a little bit of that in the Next Gen era. And of course, DS9 started out somewhat episodic, but with some plot threads beginning to be sewn early on, but they really didn't get into the heavy duty serialization for a couple of years. So, on top of that, there's the Cardassians' withdrawal from Bajor and the immediate aftermath of that leading up to DS9. I thought, okay, there's some overlap between these two things that deal with Cardassians. So I started to jot down notes for what I could do with the different characters, and that's where the subplot for the prison planet came out of. Was okay, I need a plot that will drive at least some of the characters for part of the novel, while Picard is acting as the mediator, for the aftermath of the Bajoran occupation. So that was the basic dots that I laid down, and then I started building out the story to kind of find moments for, here's a reason we can explain why Miles thought it was a great idea to transfer from Enterprise to DS9, and what was Crusher doing, and how can I introduce certain DS9 characters before the arrival of the Starfleet crew. So we get a moment for, we get Odo and Kira and Quark and Morn. I think Morn is in there a couple of times. It was just sort of an area to kind of not so much fill a gap, but maybe tell a story that you didn't think you wanted, hopefully, but you liked it when you got done. It ended up being, a worthwhile, way to pass the time, and have some fun with it, and explore some issues particularly with Picard, that I'd always found fascinating. So, and off we went.
Yeah, because I found it really cool to get that episode we never got, right? That bridge between TNG and DS9 into the pilot of Emissary, to see, what the TNG crew was doing that led up to the DS9 crew coming to Terok Nor. And it almost felt to me like I'm reading this book going, I feel like I'm reading a Deep Space Nine book with the TNG characters, because so much of this is enriched in Deep Space Nine, but also in TNG. So, I mean, is this like a vision like you had years ago? Did you ever think about this before, or was it until now that you were really coming up with these ideas of what could have happened before DS9?
I never really gave a story like this much thought until I was given the assignment. So after watching the relevant episodes and making sure of where I could step and where I had to avoid things, I just kept coming back to Chain of Command. And that aftermath, and what would it be like if Picard, still hurting from all this, gets assigned a mission that's going to basically just poke that bear, and rip off the scab on that wound, and then deal with all the Cardassian fallout. Because and there were certain places I knew that I could only take it so far, because we know that early on the Cardassians pretty much absolved themselves of the occupation. They try to downplay it almost immediately. So I know I wasn't going to get very far with that. which is why I came up with a subplot with the planet, so we could have some meat for the storyline or for the story. I know I had never really considered a DS9 next gen crossover. It's just not one of those things that was ever on my radar because I was usually working on something else. The only comparison I can come up with as far as the storyline is if you've ever watched a show called The Shield, the police drama with Michael Chiklis as an LA detective, LAPD detective. So, their pilot episode really hit the ground running. But early on in their show, I think it was in the second season, they did an episode called Co-Pilot, which was basically the day before the pilot episode. You got to see how things came together and leading you into the pilot episode. So that's kind of how things started to take shape as I was fleshing out the outline. I'm like, oh, this is a little bit like that. I'm basically doing the emissary before the emissary or the pilot before the pilot or whatever.
Well, it's kind of amazing to me too, like once you get into it, just how much story really is there too. Cause it's one of those things where I love this story and I kind of never realized how much potential there was there, because you watch Deep Space Nine, it kind of feels like, oh, the Cardassians are gone. Let's plop these Starfleet officers on the station and hope things work out, I guess. The all of the stuff that had to go into that, like the Cardassians actually leaving and what that looks like, and Bajor reaching out to the Federation, or, the Federation coming in. What does that look like? How was that all negotiated? It just feels like this story that I didn't realize I was craving until I started reading it. I'm like, oh, this is great.
Well, thank you. I guess it worked for them. It worked for you then. Outstanding.
Absolutely.
It was just, it kind of took on a life of its own once I started writing out the outline. And then, the opportunities presented themselves for cameos here or little nods to the later events there. And not too cheeky about it. I don't like to do that much of that, but it was fun to do some call outs or callbacks or call forwards, however you want to call it, because I knew I was playing in this little wedge right between two key events, in Trek history. You dance to the music that they play. So it's kind of where I was at with that one.
Well, let's get into spoilers at this point. I think, like I said, I want to get into this novel fairly quickly because there's a lot to talk about. So yeah, like we said, the Cardassians have just declared the occupation over for various political reasons. Their defeat at Minos Corva and all of this stuff that we saw in Chain of Command kind of leading into that. Picard, like you said, has been asked to kind of lead this contingent to to Terok Nor and Bajor to negotiate, how this is going to go and, whether there's going to be reparations and that sort of thing. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is Admiral Nechayev in this book, who is a character that I've actually come to really like. And recently, Natalia Nogulich was on an episode of Trek Untold is the name of the podcast. And she talked a bit about her character. And the timing was great because I was reading this novel. And I like the way you portray her here, because she, in these early days, has a bit of an edge to her. And to put it mildly, we see a bit of a softening of that relationship later. But I like her here because, to me, this is what I got out of it, is Picard has just returned from this mission that she sent him on, in which he was captured and tortured. And maybe she's feeling a little bit not guilty about that, but treating Picard with a little bit of a softer touch because, there's some humanity there, even though she's usually pretty gruff. I thought that worked really well. I liked her in this.
She's always been an interesting character for me. She's run the gamut as far as how she treats Picard that we've seen in their interactions on the show. She's been very brusque and abrupt. She's been a little more conciliatory. I figured I'd catch her on a good day. Maybe she was feeling a little guilty after what happened to him, but yet she's still his boss. So there's that remove that you have to have when you're in the chain of command like that. I wanted to try to show a little bit of both, and then of course we're setting her up a little bit in this book because eventually she's going to come back and drop the hammer on him. When she finds out about Hugh and everything. So again, it's fun to be able to play in that space when you know what's coming. And you're able to kind of craft your way around the canon, a little bit and have some fun with it without being too cheeky or too much of a call out. That's always the challenge when you write a story like one of these that's set between episodes or between milestone events or whatever. Most of the time the reader's going to know where things are going to end up eventually. They may not remember specific details, but they know generally how things are going to go. That's the challenge of writing a book like this versus something like the old lit verse books where we can do whatever we wanted. But having written so many original series novels set between events of the original show, old muscles started to flex a little bit as we were writing.
Let's talk a little bit about Picard's experience with Madred and kind of how that informs what's going on in this novel. Picard, we're used to him being this composed, self-assured captain, and certainly that's the image he still projects even when he's under some intense pressure like this after having this traumatic experience. But in this novel, he comes face to face with Madred again, who has been promoted following this debacle, believe it or not. He's a legate, and he's kind of representing the Cardassian military in these negotiations after kind of summarily dismissing Dukat from that role. What was the draw to bringing these two characters back together again, and what were you kind of wanting to explore in that relationship?
I just figured the Cardassians would do that just to stick it to Picard. I mean, for no other reason other than just to be petty. I had no doubt in my mind they would do that. Even though he you would think in the eyes of his superiors he failed, with Picard on Celtris 3, right? But the greater need for Madred at the moment was, okay, I can put him in a room with Picard and rattle him during these conversations or these discussions, these mediations, and I'll promote him to make it look like we rewarded him for his behavior, just because it'll just stick the knife in a little bit more. I totally looked at it like that through that lens. It's a head game just to screw with Picard. That was the only reason he's there. And as for Dukat did not, in the eyes of the Cardassian leadership, did not comport himself well, which is, one of the reasons why the occupation failed. But I also, it's interesting. They never really drew it out as far as connecting those dots between, Starfleet or the Cardassians being defeated at Minos Corva and the withdrawal from Bajor are very close. They're closely linked, not linked, but they come one right after the other, they're in rapid succession as far as the chronology goes. So it makes perfect sense that they're related or connected somehow, even if they're not the one thing that begat the other. It's all one big mess right now that the Cardassians are dealing with. They got smacked at Minos Corva, and this is becoming untenable on Bajor, and then the civilian council ends the occupation. So it's just chaos at home on Cardassia. So this is, what are we going to do? We're gonna smack back because we've been smacked. So let's just throw this guy into the water with Picard just to screw with him. It's petty. It's vindictive. It's beneath social mores, but screw it. So that's how I look at it.
Because I was really expecting these two to go at it, which they do in some ways.
They kind of do, but... Yeah.
But, I mean, I do feel like Picard was manly, more man to him than Madrid. He beat them at the end.
The other thing that I was conscious of when I was examining this idea was that I didn't want to retread what he went through with after the Borg, after being assimilated. They had a whole episode devoted to his breakdown and coming to terms with that. And I didn't want to redo that. I wanted to show that even though he'd been bowed a little bit in the face of Madrid, he wasn't broken completely. He got close. He admitted it. He was like right on the cusp, but he didn't break. And I wanted to show that it was a struggle, but he was reasserting himself as much as to align with the rest of the show, which doesn't, revisit this again. But just to show that he's still in control. He's not going to cede the ground to Madrid again. He figures the best revenge is to show that outwardly he can still conduct himself like a Federation diplomat and a Starfleet captain, even after all that. That to me was the best revenge. And that's Picard, though. I mean, that's his, his steel exterior, hiding all his emotions. And only the people closest to him can see through that facade. It's like, Crusher sees it, Troy sees it. And then when he meets with Kaiopaka, she can see it. But, they all understand what he's going through and how he's trying to push himself through this very demanding assignment. Low key, but still demanding assignment compared to Adventure of the Week or whatever.
Yeah, which I think was smart to have Troy in the room for that. So we could get that interplay between the two as she's exploring his feelings and being the support for him through that.
That to me was just carrying over from the episode, from when they had their session at the end of the Chain of Command where, she meets with him in his ready room to talk. He's undergoing therapy, obviously. And I wanted to make sure that was not a one-off. And it's a difficult path to walk because you don't want to make it look easy. You don't want to make it look pat when it comes to mental health or seeking therapy or anything like that. You want to present it in a positive light, that it's a good thing to do, to recognize when you need some help like that. And for a guy like Picard, who is always in control and always in command, we saw the breakdown already once in Family. We knew he was capable of being broken. I didn't see a need to do that again. But I did feel it necessary to show that, yeah, he still suffered the trauma from that experience, but he's dealing with it with help, with Troy's help specifically, and to a somewhat lesser extent, Beverly Crusher, but she's still also a very important part of that recovery.
That's always one of my greatest frustrations with this era of Star Trek, which I love, like, don't get me wrong, but Family after the Best of Both Worlds was really the exception, where you kind of actually get a bit of exploration of some of this stuff. So I really appreciate this being able to follow up on that, like, Chain of Command, and The Inner Light is another one that just kind of blows my mind that he wasn't out of commission for a year and a half after that.
Yeah. Keith DeCanado really took that idea and ran with it when he did a comics miniseries several years ago, where he examined the fact that really, by all measurable standards, Picard should be a mental health case that should not be in command of anything if we really look at it objectively, because he's been tortured by the Borg. He's been tortured by Madrid. He endured a very traumatic mind meld with Ambassador Sarek, and he has all these things going on in his head. It's like, at some point you want to check, you want to just take your chips and go home. And yet here he is, still standing there on the bridge, right, being the guy. So there's something to be said for that, but at the same time, you don't want it to appear like, well, it's easy, anybody can do it. It's hard to recover, and it's an ongoing process. It's not a one and done thing. It's always it's not always, but it's definitely going to be a lengthy process to recover from some kind of trauma like that. And unfortunately, episodic TV kind of gives that sort of thing short shrift, but we don't have that excuse in the novels. We can play in that space.
Yeah, you could do whatever. I mean, it would have been cool if Madrid and Picard beamed down to Bajor and fought it out and rolling around in the vineyard and threw grapes at each other and were in the mud, just Family.
So you read the first draft. Okay, no.
No, there's some great moments that come out of that situation. Like, I mean, that moment where he said, are there 4 viewports on that wall or 5? Like, yes. Oh, I love that little twisting of the blade. That was great.
Yes.
I remember writing that line as a note to myself in the outline, like, find a place to say something like this, in a comment box in the outline. I don't know why. It popped into my head, and I'm like, I got to find a way to work in the 4 or 5 thing, or some allusion to the 4 lights or 5 lights thing. I just didn't know how to do it.
Yeah, because you don't want it to come across cheesy or anything too cheap. And
I just didn't. I'm like, I don't know where, but I got to find some way to allude to that, and I didn't at the time know where it was going to be. It just kind of happened. I mean, the idea was there somewhere. I just didn't know how it was going to manifest. And then finally I was writing that one scene, and I could see it heading in that direction. So I'm like, okay, now I got to make sure I lay the groundwork a little bit to get there. It's just one of those things that happens. It's like late night, sleepless binge of Star Trek.
We've all been there for sure.
Even those who don't write, we all do it.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about this other plot that's going on at the same time. And it's actually kind of where we start in the novel. This forced labor camp on Cetera 3, which actually turns out to be more than meets the eye. This I found was a really fascinating kind of almost microcosm of the occupation at large. This group of Bajorans, like many others that have been taken off world and used for forced labor. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, there's something even more horrific going on. There's this secret facility that, they're doing genetic experimentation and all kinds of, things we would call obvious war crimes, kind of showing the true insidiousness of the Cardassian occupation and how they exploited the Bajoran people. I found there's so much to explore with this part of the novel, and like really showcasing the kind of casual brutality of the overseers and this idea of the superiority or the supremacy that the Cardassians feel they have over the Bajorans. Where did the idea for this subplot come from? and how did you decide to kind of work that into this story?
Well, it started because I was again, we were focusing on the ending of the occupation, and there were lines in Emissary that indicated that the Cardassians were doing their level best to just trash the place on their way out, the planet, the station, everything. So originally the idea was that it would be on Bajor. There would be this camp on Bajor, but then as I started playing with the idea of the genetic experiments and the other violations, illegal weaponry and all the other things, and then just the idea that they're going to plunder culture, they're going to take artifacts, they're going to take art, they're going to take whatever, and then why wouldn't they keep some of their favored indentured servants to serve them once this is all said and done? Who would know that they were in captivity? Because as far as anybody knows, these people are likely dead. They're missing and likely dead. So who would know? And why wouldn't the Cardassians do that? I mean, they lie about everything else. Why wouldn't they lie about this? So that turned into moving it to a different planet. That gave me more room to flesh out that aspect of what the Cardassians were doing, and not have it be like right underneath the Enterprise's nose, while they're in orbit of the planet. So that begat the idea that someone that Ro knew from childhood might be a prisoner, and there would be this elaborate means of trying to contact her. It also gave me the reason I needed to keep Worf away from the station in Bajor. Along with, I needed some of the other command crew. That was actually the fun part of the book, was splitting up the main cast to go do different things, so that they could all have something interesting to do that I could dance between as far as checking in with them. O'Brien and LaForge working on to help maintain the station or repair the station, and Data too. As far as the camp itself and the idea of there being a prison camp and an escape being plotted and all other stuff, I'm a huge fan of films like The Great Escape, Stalag 17, Bridge on the River Kwai. And I had recently read not a novel. I had recently read a book about, it's an older book, but it was about the possibility that not all of the POW MIAs from Vietnam were returned. There was speculation for years that the Vietnamese held back POWs and American POWs. And that persisted throughout the 80s and into the early 90s. I'd always been fascinated by that subject and the idea that and then of course there's also the stories about Russian gulags, where they have prisoners who are they say they died in captivity, but did they really? Particularly if they were considered spies or enemy combatants. So that fed that plot line, and then it gave it a little bit of a darker storyline to complement what was not such a real dark storyline for the main plot. It was more procedural and diplomacy and all that, versus the darker storyline taking place on the planet.
And that's something that comes up later in Deep Space Nine as well. Like, this isn't the last group. Like, season 2 opens with them finding out that there's still Bajorans being held in forced labor camps. Lee Nollis on this, I think it was Cardassia 4 in that episode or something. There's no accountability. There's nobody checking. Like, yeah, they would obviously just do this.
I mean, the accounting process, we knew that, because they even mentioned it early on in DS9, says, accounting for everybody could take years. It might never be complete. And accounting for the things that the Cardassians took could take years, the items and the treasures and the cultural artifacts. That's an ongoing thing, at least early on. So this is me sort of setting up the dominoes a little bit for things that'll happen later on in the series.
Yeah, I thought this was the more interesting aspect of the book for me, was just seeing what the Bajorans had to go through, and then in this camp, this labor camp, and having to deal with the Cardassians, and the Cardassians knowing that they're supposed to leave, but then they want to do their own thing, and they don't want to just leave. They want to basically torture the Bajorans or drag this out as much as they can. And also what was going on Bajor, where Crusher was, and what was going on in that camp. And that was an aspect of it that really, I think, is an important piece to the Deep Space Nine story, is to see what the Bajorans were going through at that time that led to what we see in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, I had to be able to not justify, but I was setting up some things that would help justify why Kira is still so angry, at the beginning, and distrustful. Maybe not angry, but distrustful at the beginning of DS9. Why are all the Bajorans still so distrustful? But yet we're going to let these Starfleet people set up house on our station. So I liked the idea that they're still a lot of boiling tension going on just beneath the surface. We see that early on in the episodes, but there's the pilot dispensed with that, and just got us in there really quick without having any real peeks at what led us to that moment. So I'm like, this is rich ground for a tie-in writer. I've got all these toys to play with to set the stage for Emissary.
One of my favorite things to come out of this part of the novel as well is the characterization of the Bajoran prisoners. And so many times in Deep Space Nine, we see the Bajorans in relation to the Cardassians portrayed mostly as victims. We have the resistance that fought back, but this one, I just loved like how organized they were, how inventive and clever they were, and how they got messages to each other, and just how organized they were, versus almost the Cardassians, who, like I said, have this kind of casual brutality, and they assume their superiority, and all this stuff is going on under their nose, and they have no idea. They have no idea how they've been cultivated as assets by these various people that form the resistance on this planet.
It's almost like Hogan's Heroes.
I was going to say, it's not so much Hogan's Heroes, but it is The Great Escape and Stalag 17, which of course inspired Hogan's Heroes, and not even so much the Great Escape film, but the actual events that became known as The Great Escape, the actual inspiration for that movie. Those prisoners had an entire organization that they spent almost 2 years planning that escape. And they had they had a whole system of, passing communications back and forth and keeping watch on the guards, which they used to call goons. So if you've never read Paul Brickhill's book, The Great Escape, which is what inspired the film, and he was a prisoner in that camp in Stalag Luft 3. It's fascinating reading, because a lot of the things that inspired me to write what I wrote in this book it comes out of that book and a couple of other books that I read about escapes, either during World War II or even during World War I. Just that's always been a subject of mine that I've found fascinating. So it was all very fresh when I was writing this outline.
I especially liked, one of my favorite bits was the surprise when the Cardassian weapons don't work, and it turns out they're just discharging them instead of charging them on just sitting on the chargers. I love that. I love that character. She was so technologically adept at doing that stuff. That was really cool.
Thank you. That was a desperation move, I think, that came out late in the game, because I'm like, how am I going to get myself out of this? So I got myself to a point where the big moment was about to happen, and the prisoners would riot and everything. I'm like, how do I get past the fact that they are not armed? And so I thought about it. It took me, I don't know, a day or two to come up with that twist, and then go back and seed it all in and everything. So she was a fun character to write, but I think I went in where she was somewhat tech savvy. And then when I hit on this idea, I had to go back and kind of beef up her role to make it more convincing that she could have pulled this off at the last minute,
I kind of loved the holy crap, it worked moment.
Right, exactly. Because that's, I mean, it's not quite Jet Reno, but we're pretty close. But yeah, I think I may have hit on that idea while I was cutting the grass or something. Because sometimes when I get stuck, I'll go do something outside. I'll either go walk or I'll cut the grass or whatever. And I'm pretty sure I hit on the idea, and then I had to spend a day or two going back into the manuscript and laying in all of that. We'll call it supporting documentation to get her ready for that moment. Because I was kind of happy with that line. Oh, holy shit, it worked. So.
Some other things in this novel that I want to talk about, and one of them is the inclusion of the USS Oceanside and this kind of lower decks California class ship, which I really appreciate. I feel like Lower Decks, for, all of its trappings as a half-hour comedy, it's really added some cool stuff to Star Trek lore, and I think you use that to great effect here with this kind of support vessel taking a break from second contact missions to help the Enterprise out on Deep Space Nine. So kind of almost in the same vein as like the SCE vessels and stuff. And I think you even mentioned that in the novel as well. When did that idea of bringing that second ship and making it a California class come in?
And my original idea was it was going to be an SCE ship. I was going to hint on that. Not necessarily the Da Vinci, from the SCE novels, but I was tempted for a minute to maybe bring in some of the SCE characters. And then I realized I had an opportunity to change that and make it a California class. And it's like you said about Lower Decks. When you boil away the humor and the jokes and the silliness, it's still a Star Trek show, and a lot of its stories are Star Trek stories. Once you they have that extra layer of snark and humor about it. But if you take all that away, it's still most of those episodes are still quintessential Star Trek like stories. So I wanted to show that the California class and those people were a legitimate part of the mythos, but obviously I couldn't turn it into a Lower Decks style representation. I had to show it in a Next Generation era style representation. So that was sort of my nod to Lower Decks, but yet with a TNG flair.
Oh, so they're not animated in the
Not
the
only in
novel?
your mind, Bruce. Only in your mind. And then you can animate everybody if you want. You can totally do that if you want. It's your brain. Do whatever you want with it. Run. And as far as naming it the Oceanside, I'm very fond of that particular town in California because it's right outside the gate from Camp Pendleton, which was my first duty station when I was in the Marines.
Oh, very cool. Also, we have Dr. Trop as the chief medical officer of the Oceanside, which, as many of our listeners are, I am a long-time reader of the Star Trek novels, of course, and I grinned to see, not quite a Denobulan-sized grin, but just about when his name popped up there.
I needed a doctor character to complement Dr. Crusher, and hell, what do you know, we had one. I like the idea of dipping into the novel verse that we created and spent all those years creating characters for, and repurposing some of those secondary characters, in these other novels. It's like just because they're, we're not writing about them in that setting anymore doesn't mean they're not good characters. I have the freedom to change them a little bit, and use them a little bit differently. They can have a different career path than we had originally. So it was fun to bring him in and make him the CMO on the Oceanside. And who's to say that, he won't go on to become an assistant CMO to Crusher on the Enterprise Z? We don't know. We haven't had one of those books yet. So there are other familiar faces that pop up here and there throughout the book, but I don't want to spoil everything unless you guys do.
I've got a few listed here that we'll talk about at some point, but basically what I hear you saying is there is a chance we may one day see like Teresa Chen and Chowdhury and any of them show up maybe?
Well, I mean, we're a ways off from having Chen in the mix because we're over a decade away from those stories.
I guess she's pretty young at this point.
Young. And as far as I guess any writer could do that if they were so inclined. There's nothing that says they can't. And even Jim Swallow, when he wrote his Picard novel, The Dark Veil, I think he had
that's right.
He had one or two nods to novelverse characters in that book as well. So I'm not even the first one to do it. I mean, like I said, a lot of us spent a lot of years creating a whole host of characters to flesh out various books, and they're just sitting there on the bench waiting to have their number called.
Well, I mean, like you kind of alluded to as well, not just novelverse characters, but you're kind of getting a lot of the old names off the roster, getting them some screen time here as well. I think Sarah McDougal is the chief engineer of the Oceanside, I think she was just in The Naked Now, right? Like, I think that's the only time she shows up.
I think she's for sure. She's only in the one. And then the other guy, I'm blanking on his name
Leland
now.
T. Lynch.
Yeah, I couldn't resist that stupid name. There was one other Argyle. Remember Argyle? Argyle was
Argyle. Yeah,
Argyle was 2 episodes early on. It was weird because there was like this conscious effort on the part of Next Gen in the first year to not have a designated chief engineer. And, I don't know why that was the case. And of course, it's funny. We think about that now and it's kind of humorous because Discovery went out of its way to never give us the name of a chief engineer for like 3 or 4 years. And I don't know that they ever actually have anointed anybody a chief engineer.
I don't think so. No.
The same thing with the CMO. It's like, Cruz is, or Dr. Culber is supposedly the CMO, but then you see all these other doctors running around from time to time. So it's like, I remember having that conversation. I remember writing Kirsten Beyer and asking, who is the chief engineer of Discovery at some point? And she's like, there isn't one. We have never named that individual. That's not Stamets. Stamets is not the chief engineer, And I'm like, but, okay.
I don't know if I don't think this was ever anything in canon, but I've seen some explanation that somebody put together at some point where it was like, the team of engineers that were responsible for the final finishing touches on the Galaxy class ship were all there as an engineering team for the first year, and then they all left and Geordi took over or something. I don't know.
I mean, there's probably something to work with in there. I don't know if I go all that far, but I guess it kind of makes some sense if you think that the Enterprise was the first one off the assembly line. But, supposedly there's at least, one before them. I mean, it's possible. I mean, I just assume, my thinking is, that maybe they just had more than one chief engineer. It makes sense that they'd have, multiple, like an assistant chief engineer, or they call them chief engineers, or there's a day shift, night shift. I don't know. Who knows? It was the Berman era.
It could be, it could be that way on Discovery too. It's a different type of ship. It's newer. They have a bunch of different engineers.
It had multiple people, especially with this. I mean, it makes sense that it made sense that Stamets was not the chief engineer. He was there specifically for the spore drive, and so that made perfect sense that this was his baby. But it also made sense that there had to be a chief engineer somewhere just doing all the regular stuff, because it still has a warp drive, it still has power, it still has the computer, it still has all the other stuff that a chief engineer has to deal with. So
maybe that person is just smoking mushrooms or something.
Could be, and there's leftover. How come we never have any shroom? How come we never have any spores? Well, because he's smoking. But it's possible. I mean, I guess just the nature of the stories they were telling just did not necessitate, having a chief engineer character. I guess Stamets was enough most of the time. They never really got to those kind of problems until later on. And then by that point, we've got, Reno. We got Jet Reno, who's probably as close to having a chief engineer as Discovery ever got.
Well, speaking of mind-altering substances, we also have Dr. Trop introducing the warp core breach to Dr. Crusher, which, as someone who did make it to the Star Trek experience 1 month before they closed, I really appreciated that reference.
I have lost my share of brain cells to the warp core breach Star Trek experience in Las Vegas, and I felt that a tribute needed to be paid to all my dead brain cells. So
excellent. I like that. That was a nice touch for sure. This episode of Positively Trek is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. A special thank you to our Constitution class supporters, Jim Stoffel, Joyce Mirren, and Paul D. Kinnear. To help out with the podcast, visit patreon.com/positivelytrek, where for a small monthly donation, you can get early access to ad-free episodes, shoutouts, exclusive content, associate producer credits, and more. Thank you so much for listening, and live long and prosper. So yeah, we've got this story kind of, like we've said, setting up Deep Space Nine. And one person we haven't really talked about much is O'Brien, and kind of his transition, I guess, eventually to Deep Space Nine. And you kind of sow the seeds of that earlier in the novel, so that by the end of the story, we see him making that decision to move over to Deep Space Nine. And again, this is another thing that, like, when I'm watching this back in the 90s, I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just like, oh, O'Brien moved to Deep Space Nine. I didn't realize how much I wanted the story of, like, what led to that. How did Keiko get convinced to go along with him, especially seeing the strain that it put on their relationship in those early years on the station and stuff. And I really liked that got worked into the story as well.
Well, that one was inspired by my own experiences. In the military, and you get a set of orders and you have to pick up and move to a different duty station. And, I had done it a couple of times before I got married, and it's stressful enough when it's just you, but the stress increases geometrically when you're taking into account how it affects your partner, and even worse if you have kids, which we did not have kids when I was still in, but my wife had to go through a couple of transfers with me, and it's very stressful because they've got their life, they've got their goals, they've got their what they want to do, and you're getting ready to uproot all of it so that you can go move across the country or to another country or whatever. And there's a lot of stress involved with that. And even though his motives were pure, he was looking for a more stable environment to raise a kid, a safer environment to raise a kid, and he was even contemplating retiring from Starfleet because he'd been in. I did the math, and it's something like he's close to 30 years, if not over 30 years of service, if you count back to the earliest references that he's made. And it's like, that's a career for an enlisted person in today's military. That's that's almost mandatory retirement. It would make sense for him to retire or take a staff position as a civilian or do something like that. So what would motivate him to leave what is a prestigious assignment and move out to this very big question mark at the end of nowhere? And it's so I kind of started mixing it in. It's like, well, he's a guy that was trained as an engineer. We know that just from what they've said on the show. And here he is manning the transporter console. But that's all you ever see. But so I wanted to go in and bake in the fact that there's much more to what his role is on the Enterprise than what we saw. He didn't just stand at the console and wait for somebody to need to beam up or beam down. There's a whole litany of operations that go into being a transporter chief. So I wanted to use that as the springboard for, this guy gets his hands dirty. He's a leader from the front type. He's a lead from the front type guy. Classic enlisted, classic senior enlisted. So a master chief in the Navy or a gunnery sergeant or a master sergeant in the Army or the Marine Corps. Just your classic grizzled, seasoned veteran who doesn't put up with a lot of idiocy from younger troops and younger officers who don't know enough. But yet it's Miles, so it's not going to be that far. So that was my idea, was that he's just being underutilized, at least in somebody's opinion. It's like this guy could be in charge of a starship if he wanted to pursue a commission. He could be a chief engineer. And I liked the idea that, that would lead into the idea that Sisko himself preferred a senior enlisted, a grizzled enlisted guy to be, in charge of operations on the ship. That would make sense. That would play into Sisko's demeanor a little bit as well. So all that went into the mix of how do I get Miles convinced to make the transfer and make it seem organic, not just for the case of like, we're moving this character over to this new show for the spinoff. I wanted to feel organic. I wanted to make it make sense. I wanted it to be justified in the character's eyes and in his family's eyes. It's like, this is a perfectly decent career move for O'Brien at this stage with his family. And he had noble intentions. I'm going to settle down. It's a space station in orbit around our planet. What could possibly go wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense. And I never really thought of it at the time, but like at the start of Emissary, it's in orbit of Bajor. This paradise is a transporter trip away.
Exactly.
Like it feels like now, of course it's a 6-hour shuttle ride once they move it to the wormhole, but that all hasn't happened yet. When they make the decision, the Cardassians, the last few who are leaving, haven't absolutely trashed the place yet. It's that dramatic irony of we all see what's over the horizon, but my poor sweet summer child of a character doesn't quite know that.
Let him have his moment. It'll be all right. Yeah, in fact, I remember making mental notes to myself. It's like, remember, the station is orbiting the planet. The station is orbiting the planet. That kind of thing. This little bitty remind, and I think I see that in a couple of times. Like, you can see the planet outside the viewport, or you can see the planet, in the background or whatever, just to remind myself of where we are in timeline. And because I've had to make that note a few times, like with the folks writing the comics and some other stuff. It's like, there's a big description of the station over Bajor. I'm like, nope, it's not there anymore. It's over there. That kind of thing. It's like, or there are other timeline things where people kind of forget where they are in the timeline. It's like, don't forget, this movie hasn't happened yet. This promotion hasn't happened yet. This uniform hasn't changed over yet. This phaser is being used. This kind of thing. I mean, it's Star Trek continuity is really just a lot. Oh yeah. There are a lot of things to keep track of when you're looking at all this stuff. But so that was my mental note to myself to remember, okay, so that in turn begat the bit in the book where the orbit is decaying and they're going down, and the solution that they come up with to get them out of danger. It's like, this wouldn't be a problem if they were out by the wormhole, but they're in orbit, so I can make use of that. Yeah, it was fun. Again, just it's like a mental reset, because for so long, if I ever made a reference to DS9, it was in lieu of its proximity to was in reference to its proximity to the wormhole. I never got a chance to play with DS9 at all, hardly. So this was, again, fun for me.
Yeah, and I always like Apaka, and we don't get much of her because she's, of what happens within that first season. But this gives you another reason to bring characters back that we haven't seen a whole lot of because they didn't play out through the whole series. So it was great to see her back.
That actually wasn't even my idea. My editor suggested that there be a scene between Picard and Opaka to address his issues, and then have that closure at the end of the book. And it was interesting. I remember going back and looking. And she shows up. She lives in exclusion or something to that effect. But I figured that she would be here due to the gravity of the situation and the need for representation with these meetings with the Cardassians. So I kind of skipped past that bit about she would break her own rule, so to speak, to attend this. It was important enough to support the new first minister. And I thought those were some of my favorite scenes to write. Were those two scenes, the 2 or 3 scenes with Opaka and Picard.
That felt really meaningful to me, like seeing these two characters meet, and when she reads his paw and stuff, that just felt like that would have meant a lot to Picard. And I think there's a line in Emissary where he says to Sisko, I've come to know the Bajorans and care about their planet a great deal. And yeah, you can, the episode Ensign Ro and that you can kind of say, okay, from that. But this novel, I feel like, really cements that as like, this is a very recent experience. He's represented the Federation to Bajor and has been the face of, having to prove to them that they mean their word when they say they're here to help, unlike the Cardassians. And that lent a lot more weight to that line, I think, now.
That's exactly the line I was aiming for, was that moment when he says that, because I'm like, well, he kind of knows him, but not really. But he's always been he was, even in Ensign Ro, the episode, he was vocal about his feelings about how the Federation handled this whole thing. And so, yeah, the idea that he and Opaka had met once my editor, that was a suggestion from my editor, and I figured out a way to incorporate it. But for me, it helped cement the transition between Next Gen and DS9. It helped, that helped with the baton pass a little bit by having these two characters interact at the end of the book after setting them up earlier on. I was definitely aiming for that conversation when he and Sisko meet. It's I wanted it to be fresh.
When I was going into this book, I was expecting a lot of Ensign Ro, and I'm a big Ro fan, and we do get Ro in this book, but I really thought she was going to be like one of the lead core characters of this, and I think it's smart that she wasn't, because we really should see these DS9 characters, the core characters, and where they play into this transition from TNG to DS9. And I was just kind of curious as to what your thoughts were about the Ro character in this story.
Well, she was necessary for, she was necessary as far as the other Bajoran character who contacts her or, gets the message out to her, ostensibly to her. But it's not like she's super Starfleet officer at this point, so she wasn't going to be the hero character of the storyline, so to speak. She was definitely important in getting the dots connected to find her friend and the planet. But I didn't want to overplay that hand too much, because at this point in the series, she's still finding her way on the Enterprise crew, and with Picard. So I had to not go too far with how she's portrayed as far as being the big hero of the day type storyline, because she hasn't gotten there yet on the show. So it was kind of a balancing act, but she was definitely important. And if I had kept the prison on Bajor, which was my original intent, in my brain, I had more for her to do, like with Kira. There would be moments where they might work together. But that started to smack a lot of what eventually happens in the novels, post DS9. And I didn't want to retread that. But again, it was more driven by the fact that I ended up relocating the prison to a different planet that altered a little bit her role to be more of a supporting character and not a prime mover.
Yeah, there's a couple really great Ro moments in this novel that I really liked. And one for sure is when she shows her vulnerability when she learns of the death of her friend on the bridge of the Enterprise. And like that was really moving to me. And I love Michelle Forbes in any role she's in, but I've always loved her as Ro. And when she shows up in Picard, and that was such a huge thing. And she shows that emotion in Picard. Seeing that moment in this novel, I think really kind of echoed that and worked really well. And then the second moment, she's not actually in, but Picard kind of talks her up a bit to is it Opaka or the First Minister? I think it's Opaka, when he's talking about, that she's made some mistakes, but he sees something in her and is fostering this redemption of her kind of thing in Starfleet at the moment. I really loved both of those scenes a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, it was during one of his conversations with Opaka. She mentions Ro. To me, Picard's relationship with Ro is just a little small it's a smaller, like you said, a microcosm of the Federation and Bajor as a whole. It's like, we really bungled this badly, and this is now a chance to try to make it right on some level. A chance to make it right. Whether they do or not is still remains to be seen at this point. But I thought and Picard's always been about the second chances. We've seen that multiple times across Next Gen, that he gives some character who's made a mistake of some sort, Sito Jaxa, another Bajoran, gets a second chance with him. And I always loved that scene with
yes,
with her, with Picard and her. And then I've always been a fan of that relationship. I think it kind of got short-sheeted in the series because she just became another recurring member of the cast, and you don't really lean into that until we get to the penultimate Next Gen episode where all that goes down with the Maquis. But and I loved seeing her in Picard. I just wish she'd been there longer. I wish she had played a bigger role in Picard. But I said that a lot during season 3. It's like, I wish we had more time for this, that, and the other.
Well, I guess kind of wrapping up towards the end here, there's one other big thing that I want to talk about. But before we get there, we've kind of got this setting up of Deep Space Nine. We spend some time with Kira, with Odo. Like we said, we get O'Brien's kind of journey here. And we don't quite get to Sisko, just because timeline-wise, we see him arrive on the station at the beginning of Emissary. But he's kind of still a bit of a presence in this novel because they keep referring to the new station commander, and it's kind of, they never name him, but I found that interesting that there's still just a little bit of he's got a presence in this novel as, he's coming kind of thing. I don't know, might play into some of the themes around his character, actually, the Sisko. I don't know. But
as the prophets foretold, he shall come.
Yeah.
I don't know that I consciously did that. I think I was just being a little coy for the sake of, I liked the idea of using him, without naming him, in the sense that I'm laying the groundwork for why certain characters are members of the crew. Like, why did O'Brien, not only why did O'Brien make the transition, but why was he sought after for that transition? I wanted to have a little fun with that without naming names. I don't know, it was an interesting balancing act because I didn't want to overplay the whole prequel to the pilot shtick. I was trying to be somewhat moderated a little bit, which is why I focused more on Odo and Quark and Kira, and tried not to allude too much about. I didn't lean anything into the Starfleet crew at all. I wanted to leave something for the people that are waiting for Emissary, I guess. So
yeah, it's not quite ending with their adventures continue in Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't need to connect all the dots. We know how the story's going to go. It's sort of like it's like right now with all the new Planet of the Apes movies. Everybody keeps wondering if they're going to remake the original. I'm like, I don't think they need to do that. We all know how that story goes. We don't need to lead right up to it. I don't need the ending shot of some Apes movie in the future to be the ship crashing to Earth, and to be continued. We already know how that story is going to play out. It's kind of same here. I don't need to overplay my hand. The pilot is next on deck. It's the next episode in the queue.
Well, I do want to talk about the very end of this novel a bit, because this was a moment where, genuinely shocking moment, which in retrospect shouldn't have been shocking because it's Garrick. But we've got that last Cardassian contingent leaving the station, and the warp engines flare to go to warp, and it disappears in a flash of white light. And then in the next sentence, you realize, oh, that was an explosion. That ship blew up. Gul Madred and his delegation are all particles gradually drifting apart in the void of space now. That was a genuinely shocking ending. And I love the scene between Odo and Garrick that results from it, and kind of setting up that relationship going forward. You kind of see why Odo treats Garrick the way he does right off the bat.
That one was one I could not resist. I had to have the final scene. I knew early on that I wanted the final scene and maybe even the last couple of scenes be on the station. The mission is over, the Enterprise is off to its next mission, but here's this station that is about to be not turned over to Starfleet. It's a joint venture with Starfleet, but the Starfleet people have not even arrived yet. But it makes perfect sense that the Enterprise and the Oceanside would stay behind, or not stay behind, but leave people on the station to help with that transition, which explains why O'Brien is there. It was really fun having to go back and figure out, okay, I got to come back, because why would Picard travel back to the station after having been at the station? I had to invent all this stuff. It was an interesting tap dance. But no, I knew I wanted those last scenes to set up what you see in Emissary when Cisco walks into the chaos that's going on. There's still fires burning on the promenade, and Quark is packing his bags and people are leaving. And I'm like, how do I get there? We had a reasonably decent ending, but okay, so we flip a few more tables before I walk out. We already had the antagonistic relationship between Odo and Garrick because they knew each other during the occupation, or at least at some point before the occupation ended. And so, the fact that he is elected to stay here, and why is he staying here, and what's this real deal about? I mean, that's something that we know we're going to explore in the series. But when I suggested to my editor that I wanted to knock off Madred, and I wanted Garrick to do it, she was just like, yeah, that's a good idea to do that. So I just thought it was a nice way to end it and kind of cement Garrick's place on the station and why Odo is watching him like a hawk. And it was, for me, it also felt like that is a DS9 scene. That is not a Next Generation scene. So I definitely wanted it to have that little, just that small but yet distinct shift in tone before the book ends. So now it's a DS9 storyline.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I love the way you put that, because that's absolutely true.
Yeah, because the last two chapters before that, it says a new beginning, and that's where it feels like it makes that transition to being Deep Space Nine. Yeah.
So that's as close as I ever got to writing a DS9 story. At least so far.
I do have to say, I do also appreciate what you were talking about with the getting the pieces to where they were at the start of Emissary, because I do remember at one point reading this novel thinking oh, the Replimat's operational, Promenade seems nice. I wonder, and then I read, it's the last delegation of Cardassians were still in their quarters. I was like, oh, it's when they leave. Okay. Yeah. That O'Brien line, it's my understanding the Cardassians had a little fun before they left or something. And I'm like, oh, it's going to be them.
Those rabble-rousers, those rousers of rabble. I kept second guessing myself. I know that. I wanted to make sure. It's what am I missing? What am I forgetting? What's the one little thing that I've forgotten? I never did find it, but to this day, I still wonder, what did I miss? What did I forget? What have I overlooked? So far, I think I'm okay.
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything, but
I'm sure I have. I just don't know what it is. So
we'll figure it out in a few years, I'm sure.
There we go. I'm sure.
So I'm just curious. I can't remember off the top of my head, but is this the first time you've really written for Garrick?
Yeah, it was my first time.
Oh, wow.
Well, you did a great job.
Thank you. I've written characters like him, like in Vanguard or something like that. Vanguard was, everybody equates Vanguard as a DS9 parallel, but we had some shady characters in those books. But no, I'd never written Garrick before, but he's always been one of my favorite characters, not just from DS9, but from across all of Trek. And Andy Robinson just plays him beautifully. And I had just listened to Stitch in Time recently, and I was reminded of just how much he embodies that character, even in that audiobook. I mean, the original novel was something else to read, but listening to him read it is just something else. I don't know if you all ever saw him and Alexander Siddig do their little two-man show at conventions. That it's kind of a follow-on to Stitch in Time, where they kind of talk back and forth. If you never got a chance to see it, you really missed out, because it was a little bit of dinner theater Trek style at those shows when those two got together and did their thing. They had a whole little play thing going back and forth. I don't know if it's ever been recorded, or at least not officially. I'm sure it's out there. Somebody's got a version of it out there. But I mean, it's the same. It's the same idea. If you've ever heard, John Delancey and Leonard Nimoy did a couple of two-man shows, Spock versus Q, and that originated as a convention thing, where they just did it at the show, and then it was recorded, for sale. I actually got to watch them tape the second one of that at a show here in Kansas City. They did a sequel, and the guy who was running the conventions back then convinced them to have him record that in Kansas City at a theater that we have. You can actually hear my wife laughing at one point on somewhere in that thing, because her laugh is very distinctive. So anyway, yeah, if you never got a chance to meet it or see it, it was definitely one of those treats for convention goers. But always been a big fan of Garrick, so this was a lot of fun to finally get a chance to try to do him justice.
Awesome. Yeah, I echo what Bruce said. You did a great job with him. He was deliciously Garricky. So
early Garricky, right? Really dark, sinister Garricky. But thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Well, I have to say I loved this novel. Like it's one of those ones that feels like it was written for me, because like I said, I didn't know that I wanted this story so badly, and I loved it.
No. It was written for me, Dan, not for you, for me.
I honestly didn't know that I wanted to write it until I started coming up with the outline. I'm like, this could be a really fun story. I mean, I feel that way about everything to certain degrees, but there are some times I'm like, man, I don't know. But this one, it was fun because I wasn't sure about it. And then as it started to come together, I was like, yeah, this could work. Maybe. We'll see, I guess. Again, kind of like writing an original series novel set during the show. It's like, there's only so far you can go, only so fast you can go. There's limitations on, where you can leave things when you're done, which is, again, I was not used to that with the Next Generation crew. So it was an interesting challenge to try to flex a set of muscles that I use for other things in this direction. And not sprain anything or pull anything or otherwise hurt myself.
Well, that's why the death of Madrid was a surprise. Because it's like, I wasn't expecting any of these characters to be killed, because you have to put all the pieces back into place. But he never had a piece that we knew that went on past Chain of Command.
I asked, because I said, as far as we know, we don't know what happened to Madrid after Chain of Command. We never see him again. He right. Shows up in novels, and I think he's shown up in a couple of comics. But of course, we know how those go. And I was just like, there's never been anything done. Even Lower Decks never pulled him back in. Of course, they will this year or something just to mess with me. No, I checked. They didn't. I was just like, he's never been. And of course, with David Warner having passed, the chances of him showing up even in Lower Decks were pretty small. But once I made sure of that, I was just like, yeah, can I do this? And editor didn't bat an eye. Licensing didn't bat an eye. They said, yeah, go ahead. Kill him twice. I don't care.
That's awesome. That's so great. Well, I guess we'll leave the discussion there. Like I said, love this one. So top marks from me. Those of you who are listening, if you haven't read this yet, I think you've made a terrible mistake, but go out and buy it now and read this novel. But in the meantime, Dayton, what do you have going on that our listeners might be interested in? I know I actually just started reading High Noon on Proxima B. I haven't gotten to yours and Kevin's story yet, but I just started today. So. Oh,
well, thanks for picking that up. Kevin and I are, our next collaboration is coming out next month. It's, by the time this airs, it'll be later this month, right? Our next Marvel Declassified book will be out. It's a deep dive at Steve Rogers, Captain America. And it's a follow-up to the one we had that came out late last year about Iron Man, all the comics continuity. So it's kind of like the Iron Man book. It was an extended interview with Steve Rogers talking about his career as Captain America, both before and after he went into the ice. It's all based on the comics continuity. So we had to boil down 80 years of Captain America comics into something cohesive and hopefully comprehensible, and basically through his eyes. It's like an extended 60-minute interview. And in between those two books, another notable author, Maurice Brodas, he wrote a similar book that takes a look at Black Panther, T'Challa. And I am told that they are very close to announcing the book that comes after ours, that'll be out next year. And it's, I can't say who's writing it, can't say what it's about, but pay attention. There should be an announcement coming out hopefully in the next few days, so we can celebrate. And then I don't know what we're going to do after that with Marvel. It's been interesting conversations we've had both with Ben Bella and Marvel proper about what we might do for them, because they seem to like our work on these books. And then I'm doing some more role-playing game work I was recently announced that I helped contribute to a forthcoming Planet of the Apes role-playing game. I did a lot of lore and backstory type writing. I've had discussions about doing some more work with Star Trek Adventures, some more work with them, and another as yet unnamed RPG has approached me about doing some work for them. Actually, me and Kevin both going to do some work for them. And then I don't know what's next. Just sort of take it one day at a time. I'd like to do some original writing if I could get my schedule cleared. I'm working on edits for a short story that'll be out later this year. It's a Sherlock Holmes riff. It's for an anthology that the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers is putting together called Multiverse of Mystery, and it's all different takes on Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Gender flipping, race changing, different time periods, different dimensions, different realities. Mine is Watson and Holmes are on the moon as military investigators. So it's like NCIS meets Outland. And Watson is the old grizzled veteran who's close to retirement, and Holmes is the young rookie probie agent on her first assignment.
Nice.
That sounds really cool.
I'd love that.
If it's fun and if it works, I might reach out and maybe try to do something more, because that's the thing. Kevin and I we've written about half a dozen short stories over the last couple of years together that are not IP owned, and every one of them has been a character or a situation or a setup or a premise that we want to revisit, including the one that you're about to read. So we were like, nice. Well, it'd be fun that we do some stuff with our own characters, and maybe flesh out some of this stuff into a novel. And then we're also talking about a collection of short stories, collecting some of our original fiction that's not tied to Star Trek or another IP, and maybe making that available for sale to folks who want to try to find our scattered short stories that have been published over, so many years. We're trying to stay busy. Keeps us out of trouble.
And you're still consulting for Paramount for Star Trek?
Yes, or? I am. I'm still consulting for Paramount in all manner of things. It is.
I'm jealous of your reading material, I'm sure.
I am spoiled on everything that comes out for the next 2 years, including Academy and Section 31. It's going to be interesting, guys. I recently saw a trailer for Section 31 that they are still trying to finish because it was without visual effects or music or sound mixing, and it really looks impressive.
Oh, wow.
Michelle Yeoh owns every scene she's in. I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to be an interesting experiment. I hope it does well, because I'd love to see them tackle Star Trek in these movie specials that don't require the ramp up of an entire television season. I mean, I think they have the resources to really kind of do what Brian Fuller originally intended, which what became Discovery, which is, maybe we have this anthology format where we can take an idea and make one story out of it. And if it lands, if it sticks and it resonates with fans, then they can go back and do some more. But I think I'm excited by that possibility. And I'm interested. I'm pleasantly surprised by what I'm seeing out of Academy. It's definitely different. It's going to be different from the other Star Treks you've seen. There's a couple of scripts that just really knocked my socks off when I read them. And of course, the one that knocked my socks off the most was the one that was co-written by Kirsten Beyer and Tawny Newsome.
I figured.
So she
awesome.
has game, folks. Don't pay attention to social media. She has game. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Wait.
I mean, it's going to be an interesting show, and the setup that they're. I mean, and I can't reveal any of this, obviously, but what I've seen so far and what I've read about and what I've been told is it's interesting. I'm waiting to see how it all fleshes out.
Awesome.
Oh, I can't wait. Oh, you had to do that to me. But you know what? I do agree. I'd like to see like the Section 31 different telemovies, I guess you could say. And, but I'd like to see like them keep going back to doing like short treks, like those little 15-minute like vignettes I like to see. And the other thing is like to see one of those of whatever written by you. So there you go.
Well, that'll never happen, because
never say never. Come on.
I'm not a screenwriter. I'm not a Hollywood writer, and I really don't have a desire to be. I really like living in the expanded universe world. I like I like helping with the books. I like writing the books. I like helping other people write their short fiction and their comics, and consulting on those things. I get a kick out of that aspect of the franchise. So like, as I tell people, one of my favorite meetings that I have every week is the meeting we have with Heather Antos and her team at IDW. We have a weekly meeting where they check in with us and give us kind of the state of the slate, where they show us everything that's in development, in various stages of the production cycle. So pages, art, covers, concepts, we read all the scripts, we read the outlines, we read arc, when they give us the storyline for the next 5 or 6 issue arc, that kind of thing. So it's a lot of fun. And then they're even pulling me in to read the short fiction for Explorer magazine, or the pitches or the actual manuscripts. So it's I don't know. I feel like I'm everywhere. Everything everywhere all at once, everywhere, whatever it is. It's like I feel that there are days when I feel like that. It's like, God, there's just so much Star Trek. So.
Yeah, you know what? If you quit your job, I'll fill in for you.
I'm not saying it's a bad job. It's really quite a fun job, but there's just days where I'm just like Star Trek, you know.
Right.
And it's not just Star Trek; it's the different flavors of Star Trek because I can bounce between, and then I got to remember where I'm at. It's like, wait a minute, I got to reset. I got to reset the clock a little bit because now we're dealing with this versus that versus the other thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at once. That's me.
Well, I definitely am jealous of your job there, and like all the pieces of Star Trek you're talking about. They're killing it over at IDW. Like, I love the stuff they're putting out. Explorer magazine, even the short fiction, we've been enjoying that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, lots of really cool stuff.
I like the Explorer magazine. I like to see the balance between, folks, seasoned pros that have been writing Trek for a while, but I like the fact that it seems to be an avenue for newer writers who haven't written Star Trek before. Not necessarily unpublished writers, but just writers who haven't had a chance to write Star Trek fiction before. That seems to be a nice little entry point for a lot of folks. So I've enjoyed the diversity of storytelling and authors that are coming to that table. So it's almost like, having anthologies again from Simon and Schuster, or, dare I say it, the Strange New Worlds contests. So
I was just going to say, kind of almost filling the void that left.
A little bit,
that's
yeah.
pretty cool.
So, I mean, I'm here in the middle of it and I'm having fun. So, and I'm not giving it up. I'm not going without a fight. So,
well, if people want to follow you online, where can they do that?
I'm still at DaytonWard.com. I'm forever linked to that website. In fact, I just renewed it and I changed providers. I've moved everything over to WordPress. So I'm at DaytonWard.com. So you can find all the links to my social media, the links to the blog, links to places where I write or have written frequently. And whatever else I decided to put on that one page. But yep, if you want one-stop shopping, internet banality, DaytonWard.com.
Awesome. Well, Dayton, thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. And we'll have to have you on again when I guess the next Star Trek novel comes along from you, which I'm hoping will be soon.
Oh no, well, guess we'll see.
Or just come by anytime you want, anytime. You don't have to do it.
We don't have to talk about my stuff. We can talk about interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So, totally do that. All right, guys. Thanks for having me on again.
Awesome. And thank you, Bruce, for coming on again. Appreciate that.
Thank you for having me. I'll come around again if you need me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening this week. We really appreciate each and every one of our listeners. And until next time, as always, stay positive. Positively Trek is produced and edited by me, Dan Gunther, and co-produced by Barry DeFord on Treaty 8 territory, the home of the Beaver, Cree, Dene, and Métis people, whose histories, languages, and cultures we respect. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations.